Good afternoon, everybody. I am so pleased to be here to tell you what you really want to know about stories, but more important, to hear your thoughts about the kinds of stories you want to do based on the information you've heard. So we're going to try to make this as participatory a session as possible after a brief opening, and try to generate remarks back and forth. There are census people in the back of the room in case we have any factual questions. But I suspect that we may not need much from them because I'm expecting, based on earlier today, everyone's going to have a lot to say. So if I could have the first slide. The 2020 census has a number of stories that are new, that are particular to this census, including the citizenship question, which we've talked about, going high-tech and the cybersecurity issues associated with that. And then also, as you may not have heard, the census will explicitly ask about same-sex marriage for the first time. We'll get to that a little bit later. But as the next slide shows, there also are stories that are essentially timeless, that come up from census to census. Concerns about whether immigrants will feel intimidated and not want to answer. Concerns about whether certain groups that historically have been undercounted will actually respond. And other kinds of topics that seem to come up every time the census is taken. So what we're intending to do with this session over the next hour and a half or so is do three things, as the next slide says. We'll give you story ideas or talk about story ideas from the census timetable. As Bob Groves remarked, there are certain predictable stories you can do, but there also may be some unpredictable ones, and there may be ways you can dive beneath those issues and talk about broader issues. We'll talk about the new issues that will come up, and we'll also talk some about census data that you can get now, easily available, to help inform your coverage. If there's time, and there may not be, we'll try to do some live on the internet look at census data, but at the very least we'll be able to point you to sources where you can find this for yourselves. So, story ideas from census operations. As the next slide tells you, my pitch is essentially there are at least three kinds of stories you can do off every operation in the census timetable, all of which have been run through during previous presentations. You can explain that operation, the role it plays in a successful count. You can look at some of the metrics of success, and then you can stand back and look at the bigger picture in your community or in the nation and see how this census operation plays to those broader themes. So, for example, the address list. This was something that was talked about, that the census address list is the backbone of a successful census because everyone is counted where they live. You have to know where those addresses are. Well, what does that address list story tell you? Here are some ideas that I came up with. One, just explain the address list. The second is look at some of the metrics of the address list. Talk to some of the local officials who have been involved with the Census Bureau and find out, are they confident that every census, that the census officials have gotten those addresses? And then the bigger picture is, in areas that are growing, it's hard for the census to keep up with all the new addresses. But in areas where there's irregular housing, people are doubled up and so forth, those are obstacles. Either one's an interesting story. And let me throw it to Paul to see what else he wants to add to that.
I think the second one is a great one for anybody who's covering a geographical area because, as they said, the LUCA process has just about the whole country, the local officials involved. And so while they can't disclose the Census Bureau's address list that they're working from, what they can tell you is the results after their review. Yeah, we found 172 addresses that the Census Bureau didn't have, and here's how we know that, because we run the water utility, or because we know that this developer just put a bunch of lofts in an old factory building, et cetera, et cetera. And that way you'll get you have people whose job it is to really understand the local lists, the EMS lists, the tax lists, the water hookups, the electrical utilities, and how that meshes with the Census Bureau, and exactly where this is in addition to what kinds of housing the Census Bureau missed. Or there's some sort of dispute and the Census Bureau says, okay, thanks, sure, we'll add those to the list. The other thing that's really, I think, interesting is in looking at what the places are that are changing in your community when they're building the address list is just look at the blocks that they're going to actually have to go out and do in the field canvassing to figure out the address list. Those are the places where they think that there's been enough change that they really need to get boots on the ground to figure out what are the addresses. And the example I just mentioned is this is happening in a lot of places in this country as we urbanize. In the last 10 years, there's been a strong trend of this sort of thing. Where an old factory is now 37 condos or something like that. Aerial imagery may not pick that up. It might pick up the fact that, and the Census Bureau picks up on this, oh, there's all of a sudden cars parked around there at all times of the day. We'll throw it into the field address canvassing list to check that out and find out exactly how many units are in that old factory now. The other thing is, and Dee's slide showed this, 2 doorbells may be the only sign that you see on a single-family house, and that was from a GAO report that talks about how hard it is sometimes for people to understand this. But the local people who are doing the address checking understand this because of a variety of reasons, and they're the ones who can say, we're looking at this sort of thing, and we found, because they're the ones who, if you have a building permit, because all of a sudden you've got a granny flat in the back or a basement apartment that you've converted, they can pick up on it that way. So those are the places where you can really tell local stories about the differences in the address list, and that gets to the completeness of the count.
And you can also check with GAO, with the Office of Inspector General and the Commerce Department, which monitor how the census is going. I think at least one of them has already put out a report on the address list canvassing operation. So you can look at some of the metrics that they've been looking at to see how they've assessed how well the Census Bureau is doing. And they're also a somewhat independent voice to look at what are the challenges that the Bureau is facing. We're going to move through a couple of other census operations. I'll talk a bit about story ideas for those, but if anyone wants to throw out ideas or thoughts they have on the address list, we could chat about them now, or we could keep going.
I was thinking about the opposite too. In Detroit, we have a lot of vacant buildings. Obviously, the city owns 1 out of 4 parcels in Detroit. The land bank, that is. I'm sorry, not the city, but the land bank. And a lot of times when you go house to house, you'll notice that there are some buildings that look occupied, but they're not. If you talk to the neighbor, it's because people are trying to keep squatters away from. It's the opposite, right? You think someone's there, and they've done a great job in disguising the building. So I think some of the issues depending on what community you're in, is really the accuracy in trying to figure out, is a house occupied or vacant, and how neighbors add to that.
That's a great point. And actually, I know a number of cities that have vacant and derelict buildings. They have active demolition programs. And you would think that they will be telling the Census Bureau, if it hasn't already noticed, that, yeah, we tore that building down a month ago, when they do their local address checks. And you would hope that they would do that so that the Census Bureau wouldn't have to send somebody to a vacant or to a demolished building. But that's the other side of it. This is a way for them to sort of see, to bring their updates that they're doing constantly by tearing down buildings or boarding them up to the census process.
But, one of my pitches to you will be that the census can be part of a lot of other kinds of stories. So you could do a story about how people try to keep squatters out by making buildings look occupied, and then mention in a couple of paragraphs, with the 2020 census coming up, this will be a challenge to census officials in trying to come up with a good address list.
I'd just add one more thing. The American Community Survey data, which is published every year, has a table in it that says why a unit is judged vacant, and there's a variety of reasons. And you can use that data which comes out to the block group level in your area to sort of help drive some of those stories. That's in the American Community Survey data that comes out every year.
So the next slide is about the census operation for outreach to reduce the undercount of hard to count groups. And as you can see, there are differences by state in that rate, and there are very detailed estimates available, both at the national and state levels for those undercounts to help inform your coverage. So what kinds of stories could we envision doing out of that? Well, so first to recap in the next slide, as we know, the census misses some groups more than others. Racial and ethnic minorities compared with non-Hispanic whites, renters compared with homeowners, and another group who we haven't talked much about, but we could, which is young children, newborns through age 4, 1 million of whom were missed in the last census, according to census evaluations, which is kind of astounding. How can someone miss a child? Some of these children are in households that themselves aren't counted, so the whole household is missed. But some of them are in households where the household might be what's called a complex household. So the child might be a grandchild, and the grandparent might think, oh, I'm not sure I should count that child because I don't have a formal court order that says I'm responsible. Or there might be a child who's staying with another relative, an aunt or uncle, and the aunt or uncle thinks, well, I'm not the parent, I shouldn't count this child. It's a very interesting issue that the census recently, within the last few years, commissioned research on for the first time, and there's a good report on the website looking at that topic. So that might be a nice story for you. To go to the next slide, so you can write the basic overview, hard to count outreach. It's a big, important job. It plays a role in about 1/3 of census operations. Metrics include, are they meeting their hiring goals? Are local community groups signing on? And as we know, some have expressed concerns with the citizenship question. Are they still willing to help out? How does your local population compare with the nation's? And then the bigger picture would be, zoom in on any of these groups to enrich your coverage. And, next slide, some of these hardest to count groups are growing more rapidly than the population overall. It gives you a chance to explore the growth of those groups in your own community. I mentioned already the young children, which offer you an opportunity to see how U.S. households are changing and becoming increasingly apt to be more complicated, not just the simple, nuclear family of decades past. And then lastly, is there an active complete count committee in your state or community? I think this was mentioned earlier. Many of the members come from some of these hard to count groups and might have something to say. And if there's no committee, why not? Paul may have something to add to this.
I think if you could just go back to the previous slide for a second and look at the groups that he outlined that are
One more back. Yes.
Yeah, this one. So obviously some folks don't want to be counted. Will go to some length not to be counted. You can understand why that is. That's one challenge for the Census Bureau. The young children is another issue. Sometimes they just are part and parcel of those households that don't want to be counted, and that's partly why they're missed. But the issue of complex households really get you a chance. These kids, obviously the kids are not trying to hide, and it's kind of hard to miss a kid. That, it's not like, well, where's our 3-year-old today? I'm not sure where he's at. I have some older kids, and I'm not sure where they're at, but they don't live in the household anymore. So these kids are not trying to hide. So obviously a piece of that is this whole sort of idea of complex households. And the idea of a household and its stability across time. It may change week to week and month to month. Joint custody arrangements is one example. Poor people have very disrupted lives in terms of where are they, and they may not know where they're going to be next month because they're going to have to move again. So that's a piece. It's a way to get into the issues of the structure of the families in your community.
Yeah, question. Wait for them.
So on the children, the million undercount, is that the largest cohort, largest number of an undercounted population, that 1 million number,
Well,
as compared to households or any other category?
It's larger than, in terms of rate, than some other age groups, but I don't think in terms of number that it's the largest, and I'm going to send you back to someone who knows more about this than I do.
So Burton's actually heading up a lot of work on the undercounted children, and might want to talk about it, but we've always said that the undercounted children is the number one largest undercounted group, but fastest growing as well.
it depends on how you break things up.
I think it's the fastest. I hadn't thought of that. It's the numbers are increasing faster in that population group than any other population group. Whether its total number is bigger than like the undercount of the African American population, I'm not sure. I don't think it would be. I don't know something like that. That sounds right. Yeah, you talk.
So the undercount of children is not a laughing matter. It's been measured in the 1990 census, the 2000 census, and again in the 2010 census. It's been on the order of 4 or 5%, and it's higher for non-white than white. So I think it was like 7% roughly in the 2010 census for Hispanic children. So it's a serious problem that is very hard to solve. If it was an easy problem, it wouldn't be around for 3 censuses, and the Census Bureau is doing the best they can, but it is a very hard problem.
And the census is actually taking some steps this time to try to address it based on the research that it commissioned. It's updating the language that it's giving to respondents, specifically asking them to count any adult children and babies rather than just everyone living at this address. So there's a specific wording. They're also training their enumerators to probe to make sure that children are counted, and they're doing outreach to partner groups to emphasize this issue.
I would just add, go ahead.
Go ahead, Paul.
I was just going to say, just to tie this back into funding, obviously young kids, we spend a lot of money on children, daycare centers, Head Start programs, preschool programs, primary school programs. If you miss those kids, your city doesn't know that it needs, when they show up, to have the facilities and the teachers ready for those kids.
So one of the reasons that Dee mentioned about missing kids is ambiguity about who should report, especially in dual custody things. There's another group sort of like that with ambiguous ties to a household, and pervasively young single males get undercounted for a similar reason. Live with the girlfriend for 3 days a week and goes home for 4 days a week. It isn't clear where this guy lives, and hence they're undercounted.
Where you are on April 1.
Right. Just one final point. Among the headwinds that the Census Bureau is facing this time, look at the middle category there. Renters are more likely to be undercounted. Well, the homeownership rate is several percentage points lower than it was in 2010. So even if they're getting better at some of this work, they've got, extra challenges just based on, it's baked into the population.
So I had a question about the sort of the homeless population and how they are counted. Does the Census Bureau kind of have any mechanism to kind of vet that data? Because the cities have a sort of might have an interest to inflate that numbers. How is that quality assessed?
Well, the Bureau certainly does the count in cooperation with cities, but it eyeballs the numbers to make sure that they are credible. They use census employees as part of the count. There may be more vetting that I'm not familiar with. I have not heard of issues of inflating, and the concern with homeless seems to be the opposite, that they're so transient that they're more likely to be missed. I think John wants to throw something in here.
So the census is a point in time estimate of the homeless. And a lot of the groups that are advocates and deal with the homeless population deal with a population that's at risk. And that population goes in and out of homelessness, periodically. What the census does is it doesn't capture the population at risk. It captures a point in time of who's homeless. So there are some individuals who are at risk during the census that are actually in homes. So that sometimes creates some concern among the advocacy groups that deal with the homeless population, because the census numbers are lower than the population that they provide services to.
And I might add, the count is done by census enumerators who are trained for that operation. The official count is not done by the city. Our partnership with them is gaining access to some of the areas that the homeless people tend to be, and some of the cities will know under which viaducts we have homeless encampments, in which parks are there homeless encampments. But our own staff, following our quality procedures, actually goes and does the count.
I just want to add to the young children ages 0 to 4. There was also a report that was put out, I think it was 2013 or 14 by Naleo, and it estimated that half of those children were Hispanic or Latino. Is there any more data regarding this community, this this trend, and what is Census doing to try to prevent that from happening again?
I know that we're continually looking into the data to understand that. We have established a task force at the Census Bureau, which includes a couple of people working under contract, Debbie Griffin, who's done a lot of work on this issue within the Census Bureau, Bill O'Hare, who's done a lot of work externally on this issue. That task force is working in concert with a working group from our National Advisory Committee on the Undercount of Young Children that's chaired by Arturo Vargas from Naleo. And we're looking at, Dee mentioned some of the things, but we have an extended partnership effort at the national and local levels that is going to explore what can be done in this area. We're building it into the messaging and in our advertising. It's an issue we take very seriously.
So, another question, yeah.
I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. I appreciate everyone's discussions on the different demographics, Hispanic communities, non-Hispanic communities. Can anyone address how we should be reporting on multi-ethnic communities? Myself included. When we're looking at the data, does it distinguish between folks who are multiple backgrounds? Are there any unique kind of trends or factors with those communities as well?
Yes, the census began accepting multiple race responses a couple of decades ago, and has done a lot of work since then on reporting out numbers and characteristics. This is obviously a group that's growing very quickly due to intermarriage and all kinds of other trends. So on the census form, when they ask race, it says check all that apply. That allows people to have numerous groups, although most people who do check more than one only check two. I know Paul's going to want to say more, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
I was going to say one thing to sort of study up on this is to go look at the ACS data for your area, because there's sort of two ways the Census Bureau reports this stuff. And right now, ethnicity, Hispanic ethnicity, is still a separate question. So there's the race question, and then there's the Hispanic ethnicity question. So you can be white Hispanic and white non-Hispanic, black Hispanic and black non-Hispanic, et cetera. So you can see that in all of its crosstab glory in the ACS data for your area right now. And there's two primary ways that the Census Bureau reports out because of this multiple race possibilities. There's two primary ways that the data is produced. And the shorthand for that is alone and then alone in combination. So if I just check white, I will be counted in the white alone category. But if I check white and black, I would be counted as white and black. So there you're basically the 100% in the table is not the number of people in the area, it's the number of checkoffs on all the forms on the race questions. So there's the simple way to count those people, excuse me, is there's a category called two or more races. So it's white, black, et cetera, and then two or more, but you can see it all blended together in the other version of it. So that's one way to go look at the data now, and the 2020 data will be produced probably in very similar ways.
I've advanced the slides because I was going to talk a little about race and Hispanic origin later, but this shows you how the question will be asked and some changes from the past. There had been a proposal to combine the race and Hispanic questions into one, primarily because many Latinos feel that the existing categories don't describe them. And then other race, which is one of the options, was becoming such a fast-growing category that it was rendering the census data much less useful to the Bureau. This option, however, didn't happen. The Office of Management and Budget, which must approve changes to census forms, didn't act on it, and the Census Bureau announced that it was going to go ahead and keep the question as it was, with some changes. One of them is that if you answer white or black, for the first time you'll be asked about your origin. So are you German? Are you Irish? Are you Somali? Are you Nigerian? And they're hoping to derive some richer, more detailed data. Certainly you will, as journalists, get a lot more information about some of the respondents in your community. They're on the race choices, as a result of essentially public opinion, the word Negro has been deleted as a choice in the African American and Black category. This was based on the fact that although this word had appealed to some people, a growing number also found it offensive, and the Census Bureau felt that to encourage response, it should delete that word. There also had been a proposal supported by many of the largest organizations advocating for Arab Americans and the Middle Eastern population in the U.S. to include a category called shortened MENA, that is, people from the Middle East and North Africa, that they could be asked to check off a box if that's how they wanted to self-describe. Currently, most people who are from that region or who would otherwise describe themselves that way are included under the white category.
Yes, I know that the controversial issue has been the undercounting, but for the first time it catches my attention, the overcounting of certain population. I would like to get some guidance as to how to go about covering that, because I had never heard of it.
An overcount, yeah.
Overcounting, yes.
Essentially, the white non-Hispanic population, now the majority in this country, has been historically overcounted, and that has a number of complicated reasons, some of which were referred to earlier. I think was mentioned that some people have two homes, so if you're in Florida part of the year, Michigan part of the year, it's possible that you could be counted at both, although the Bureau tries to remove the duplicate record. There are college students who might be counted both at the dorm and at home. Paul might be able to suggest some other examples, as might Census Bureau people, but essentially the white population is also better off and more likely to respond than some of the racial and ethnic minority groups.
I was just going to say, one thing on this new form, the detail that's now going to be available under white and black, there's a couple things Dee mentioned. The separate MENA category isn't going to be on the census, but there will be at least some detail coming in under white, people from the Middle East and North Africa, where there probably will be better data about who those people are and locally than we've had in the past. And the same thing under black. About 10% now of the black people in this country are immigrants. So the African and Caribbean diasporas, this will give us better data on those than we've had. Good story possibilities.
On that note, it seems like certain areas are weighted more than others. Like, for example, Cuban has its own category, but like white, if you're, half German and half Lebanese, I guess you have to pick one. Or if you're half Haitian, you know what I mean? So what is there something political going on with why there's a Cuban category? And is there any option for people to be more than one kind of white person or more than one kind of black person?
Somebody from the Census Bureau want to talk about these are called the prompts, those little examples, and I think that they're numerically based, right?
They have been historically numerically based. We have some really good presentations, particularly on the Hispanic origin and race and the questions and the research we've done over the last decade on this. Happy to try to find some decks and send it back out to the group, which really goes through sort of historical questions, but also the results of those questions. But the prompts were meant to, based on the large concentrations of those ethnicities, to prompt and solicit better, more detailed information. In previous censuses where a group may not have had a listing, we saw a depressed count. So we have been trying to understand that, because if you give a prompt, you're more likely to actually put a particular prompt as well. So there's a lot of research that, from a survey methodology standpoint, that's gone into it that we've tested. But Cuban specifically is on there because it is one of the larger population groups within the Hispanic population, but certainly not as large as Mexican. Salvadorans, there was an issue on that during I believe it was the 2000 census, where the Salvador population didn't have a prompt at the higher stuff, and so in New York City we saw sort of a lower count of Salvadorans there than expected, and Joe Salvo, the New York City planner, had documented some of that, I believe.
Question was, how are categories chosen?
That, yeah, on the white and the black, I'm going to have to get back to you, Tara, on that. I'm not quite sure that's something new that we're doing, but Jim?
So are you talking about the examples that follow the white? Those were picked based on the percent of the population that are of those categories as examples. No, you can fill in for the white category, the black, anywhere there's a write-in, you can put in multiple responses. So like, for example, I'm English and German. I would put English and German. I can fill in both. We use that data, so it's not like we pick one or the other. And that's true for all of the write-in categories. So if you're white and black and you fill in write-ins for both of those, that's the detailed information about the characteristics.
Is the issue with this, the Hispanic origin and race being two separate questions, has the issue been that Latinos are not, I guess, relating to being Hispanic because they don't have any Spanish origins?
I think Margot could answer that pretty well.
Has there been, historically, have Hispanics or Latinos just identified as white and black?
Yeah, I think what Dee said is that the concern, what prompted the discussion about combining the questions was the fact that the other race category, I think, is now the third largest, quote, race category in the United States. Other race.
Yes.
In other words, and as the Hispanic Latino population has grown dramatically, they don't relate to the American race, the U.S. race question. the second question. There's Clara Rodriguez has done work on this going back to 2000. La raza doesn't translate very well. It means something different in Spanish and English. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Bureau moved toward racializing Mexicans in 1930, and in 1930 census, Mexico was a race category. Now, again, more in the weeds history. Until the 1950s, if you were not white or African American origins, you could not naturalize if you were an immigrant. They were what was called aliens ineligible for citizenship. The Mexican community in Mexico and protested to the State Department, and the Mexican community in the U.S. protested. And so in 1940, the Mexican category went off the race classification of the census to be returned in 1980 as a separate ethnicity question, right? In other words, there's still a resistance to being considered a race, right? There's a lot of very good historical analysis written on this and that I can point somebody to.
And if I could self-advertise, at Pew Research, we've actually done a history of the racial categories used in the census, starting from the very first. The Census Bureau has done a nice infographic and history of that as well. And the other thing I would add is that the Census Bureau's own research, which was done in conjunction with considering a combined question, found that I believe most Hispanics, if offered the option, would only check the Hispanic box and not check a race category.
Can I just give
John
a little
wants to
more
add.
background? So the Census Bureau doesn't make up these racial and ethnic categories. They're established by the Office of Management and Budget. And there have been a number of different issues where the Office of Management and Budget has issued guidance to the whole federal government about how you collect and tabulate racial and ethnic data. And in 1997, the standards were revised for the last time, and what came out of that was that you will have a Hispanic ethnicity question, which will be asked first, and you will then have a race question, which would ask for at least 5 of the major race groups. For the decennial census, it includes an other race category. And the census, working within that framework and with OMB, has been doing lots of research on how to best utilize that framework to get the most inclusive answers of the population over the years. The problem has been that it seems like for at least a third of the Hispanic population, when they answer the Hispanic question fine, well, not fine, but they answer it pretty well, and then they get to the race question, and about a third of them, some identify with white, some identify with black, but a lot of them identify with other, and they check other, and they write in an Hispanic category like Mexican or Latino. They've never read the OMB guidance that says, no, that's not a race. You just can't do that. So the Census Bureau found that when they did a combined question where they put both together, that the incidents, and gave them the opportunity to check all that apply, the other race category went from like the third largest race category to about 1%, which is what another race category should be. And it meant that they were identifying only as Hispanics would only identify as Hispanic. Or if they wanted to identify as Hispanic and white, they would, but they wouldn't identify with the other race category. So that's sort of a synopsis. And then they did a lot of great research, got a lot of buy-in from just about every stakeholder group that was the right thing to do, and then OMB never took any action on it.
Just one more footnote on this. He said that categories were changed last in 1997, which is a long time ago in the demography of this country. But this framework of a separate Hispanic question and a separate race question was set up in 1977, right, when the Statistical Directive 15 was put out. And the federal government was just really coming around to the idea of trying to get every agency to at least use the same minimum categories and basically having to provide all kinds of data that was coming out in a more standardized way. So this framework is really ancient when it comes to how different the country is now, and the Census Bureau gets to have the fun of trying to sort of bridge between the categories that are politically locked in and the dynamics of the population.
So this is just a comment, So I'm speaking for myself, so not representing anyone or an agency. So this notion that race is a social construct. So we know that approximately 2 million Africans were brought into Mexico. Okay? And Mexico is heavily of African descent. Mexico, however, decided in the 1800s, if I'm not mistaken, to no longer do a census with racial categories. Okay? But for many years they had done that. Okay? So in dealing with, and I've worked on the African immigrant issue in California, okay, looking at African immigrants of higher social economic status in Los Angeles versus refugee immigrant communities of African immigrants in San Diego. And what you get is, Africans who come here do not want to identify as black, nor do people of African descent from the Caribbean. They don't, because they know the history of the country, of this country. So why would they want to identify with a group that is at the lower end of the social structure? So who wants to identify as black? No one, other than African Americans themselves, rather than identifying as Negro. And just to put a fine point on it, and this is David Levering Lewis, right? Almost 500,000 of the mulattoes counted in the 1910 census had, quote, passed over into the white race during the intervening decade because the lines of classification were redrawn in 1920. And there had been this mulatto block that you could check, but then it was just either checked white or black. So all the mulattoes just passed over into white.
So let me say something to address the question of self-identity, because there actually is a lot of very interesting research coming out about that. It's somewhat relevant to the census. The Census Bureau itself has cooperated with outside researchers to look at people who've changed their racial or Hispanic self-identification from one census to another, and millions of people do so for very interesting reasons. Might be worth a story for you. We and others have done research on people who might have a Latino name and a Latino grandparent, but who don't self-identify as Hispanic on the census. Because it is a self-identified concept that we now use on the census, as opposed to back in the 60s and earlier when the enumerator came to your door and decided what you were. It's open to all kinds of interpretation, and there's lots of really fascinating research on that about a lot of different groups.
And then relating to self-identified, for American Indians, is the term enrolled a principal tribe, is that something that's new right now? And also if that, writing down Navajo or your tribe, is the Bureau doing something to differentiate like the different names that we call ourselves? Because Dene is also Navajo. Dene we refer to ourselves as. Ojibwe, they have 3 different ways to spell Ojibwe, and they also refer to themselves as Anishinaabe, which is their traditional name. But I was just wondering to know if the Bureau is doing anything about that. That's also another big old issue.
I'm going to throw that one back to the Bureau. What is true, though, is that your answer does not mean that you are necessarily counted by that tribe as their member. The tribal entities, I think, control their own membership. But I think Jim Treat in back of you will answer the question you asked.
So the enrolled or principal tribe, I believe, was done in 2010. So that language hasn't changed. And when we get write-ins, so the great thing about doing it online, we actually get it keyed right. So that's one of the reasons why I think Al and others talked about our principal method of collection would be to have people do it online, because we actually get the right spelling. When we do the data capture on the form, the check boxes are easy. All that written in text goes to optical character recognition. It's read in. If it can't be determined, it goes to key from image. where we capture where someone actually reads it and keys it in. But we have a whole coding operation that sits behind all those write-ins, where we do a code book, basically. We look it all up, and we classify those write-ins into digital representation of what those responses are. I don't know specifically about the examples you gave, but there's a lot of work that's done.
When I was at Census, we did a number of consultations that I went to most of them with various American Indian tribal leaders. And the Census Bureau has a very, very detailed code list of Indian tribes that's been compiled, of Indian responses, American Indian responses that they've compiled over the years. And so any of the things that you mentioned would definitely be coded under the Navajo, because they've had those responses over years, and they work with the Navajos extensively to develop their code list so they can, get the counts right.
So-
Again, I would put in a plug for the ACS data, because if you want to look at actually what all those write-ins get reduced to right now on the ACS form in terms of the actual tribal numbers, the tribal categories and numbers that are reported out, you can go look at the ACS data. I think the tribe list is over 100 different tribes if you count the Alaska Native and American Indian tribes that the Bureau is tabulating.
So I rewound the slides back so we can pick up a little bit about what we're talking about, but again, interrupt, and we're going to have some other talks about likely issues in the census. Just to advertise both for the Bureau's Rome tool, and then there's also a hard-to-count 2020 mapping operation that the folks at the City University of New York have done up at the request of some advocacy groups that let you really drill down and look at in your own community where some of these hard-to-count groups live. And it can really give you a vivid tool to explore, down to quite granular areas, both specific groups and some characteristics, such as, Paul, I'm going to let Paul go into this because he's the expert.
So actually, first of all, I think this is tract level data. Yes, tract level data. We sort of brushed over that a bit. Census tracts are not the smallest group, smallest area that the Census Bureau uses, but they really are kind of the most important if you're doing local journalism. And they don't necessarily conform to the kinds of neighborhood boundaries you're used to, but they are, one great thing about them is that they stay the same census to census, so you can do comparisons. Or if they decide they have to split it, because they try to keep them all roughly the same population, you'll see Census Tract 101 becomes 101.1 and 101.2 or something like that, and you can easily reconstruct the trail backward. And here's a good example in this one where there's a whole variety of group that, they've listed up the ACS data, again, is just sort of showing through here. And you can look at, obviously, the different types of populations that have, that are sort of, key markers in terms of, is a group going to be hard to reach? And you can say, well, what is there? Wait a minute, I know that area. Why is it that, oh, there's more renters there than I thought there were? Okay, so that gives you some local insight.
The next census operation that is one that's going to have a lot of stories going on is this non-response follow-up. You already have heard a lot about it. It's going to be one of the most crucial and expensive operations, and it will have its own metrics. Last time, the Census Bureau published very regular updates of the response rates in different localities, so a lot of folks did stories off of those. There were, I guess, competitions, if that's the right word, to see whether one locality could beat another in its response rate. But the bigger picture to look at, of course, is, well, why are Americans so reluctant to answer surveys in the first place? All of that, I think, are stories that NRFU, which is the abbreviation for non-response follow-up, can give you. Does anyone want to ask about any other census operations and brainstorm about story ideas off of them?
One thing I would suggest, the Census Bureau people will tell you this, don't try to follow a census taker around. They get really, really touchy about that sort of thing. Understandably, it's hard enough to get people to respond, but if they think that there's a reporter anywhere nearby, that's no good. The Census Bureau people get very touchy about that. So it's just a good idea not to go anywhere near a census taker who's out there on their rounds.
Yeah. The Census Bureau has stock footage, but they always emphasize that it's not real census takers doing, yeah. So it'll show someone, there was that picture I had of someone buzzing a doorbell. Well, that's a recreated photo. It's not an actual census taker doing. In fact, I remember during the 2000 census in Alaska, when Census Director Pruitt tried to go enumerate the first household, there was a gaggle of reporters following him, and he was trying to push them away because he didn't want this first household to be identified. So they're pretty serious about not letting you interview or talk to census takers. And census takers take, I think, a lifetime oath of confidentiality.
Right.
Well, I wouldn't, because I don't work for the Census Bureau, but the Census Bureau does have some, I'll let them talk about it.
So as much as we would like, no. So if a census taker is actually doing their business and the media starts following around, they're going to stop and not do their work. So we do provide a lot of B-roll simulating how the actual non-response follow-up work actually takes place, and that seems to work quite nicely. Some more enterprising reporters simply go into a neighborhood and knock on a door that maybe we were or weren't at and just talk about the census. So we've seen it over the years change a little bit differently, but based on whatever your needs are, just let us know and we'll try to work with you wherever we can. I didn't say go to the door as a census taker. I just said, okay.
I think it's just a general question.
Yeah. It is a crime, yes. I don't know the severity of it. It actually, it is a crime to impersonate a census taker, yes. And then the question was whether or not we could interview. Yes, you could absolutely profile census takers, the area census office managers. There's 250 of them, right? So you can highlight any of the census workers. We'll work with you to set those up, and they can tell you their backstory about what attracted them to the job, to being involved in their community. Those are also the partner stories I was telling you about. So if there's a local community organization that is really going gangbusters, libraries, every single library is really going to be focused this time around because they saw a huge increase in traffic during the Affordable Care Act, trying to sign up for health insurance. And so we're partnering with them right now to try to define how we can help them and how they can help us to provide internet assistance at all libraries to complete the 2020 census.
I don't know if this is a suggestion or a question, because I assume you must do this. Part of my job, I'm on an investigative team, so I answer tip lines, which is fascinating. Tip lines. And just a huge number of elderly people who are being scammed. And I wonder what your communication strategy is, and certainly is, I think, part of our job in the media is explaining to people, here's what to expect, here's what they should not be doing. Like asking for your driver's license, I'm assuming that's not part of it. I'll get that call.
So thanks for the question. So we get this all the time across our surveys because they don't think the Census Bureau does anything in between the decades. So a couple different things. One, we work with consumer affair advocates, and we periodically will send out announcements about the surveys we have out there, and here's what to expect. We do have a web page about how to identify a census worker, so we'll have to amp that up for 2020 to, here are the things that we will and won't do. We don't want to give away like a badge and things like that, but we will say federal ID, and we may give you a sample, but we don't want it to be the actual sample because of how people might be able to lift that and then try to impersonate a census taker. But our number one priority is for somebody to feel safe, right? So if somebody does come to the door, whether it's a census taker or not, and you don't feel confident, they should provide you a phone number to call their local office that will verify it is in fact a Census Bureau worker, right? So you should never open your door to anybody if you're not confident about it, right? So that's the number one thing. But we will need to, and maybe we can talk about what are some of the things that you would need from that tip line type perspective that we can get ahead of now, and maybe come up and jointly work on something that, gets rid of some of the myths that you might be fielding on your end.
I was just going to make one story suggestion. Dog bites.
Or there was also a javelina, somebody's pet javelina that attacked a census taker in 2000, I believe. But there are actually potentially more serious attacks on census workers that come up every time, and it's good to be mindful of that. Someone was just asking the question that I will just answer, which is we're going to talk about some of the likely issues in the census, and one of them is sexual orientation and gender identity. So since you asked that question, I'll skip right to that issue. So for the first time ever, the Census Bureau will explicitly ask about whether people are same-sex partners or spouses of the person who filled out the census form. Now, to back up a bit, remember that the census is conducted by household. So they ask about the relationship of everybody in that household to the person who filled the form out. It used to be called the householder. The householder used to be male, but of course we're more complicated now, and it's basically the person who fills out the form and everybody else in the household. So one of the questions they'll ask, they used to ask, is that second person the spouse or the partner? But now, due to research that found that they've been overcounting same-sex marriages, they will explicitly use the word same-sex. So that's one of the options, same-sex partner or same-sex spouse. There was some movement to include sexual orientation and gender identity more broadly. That is, to perhaps include some other gender category other than male and female, or to ask about sexual orientation. That didn't go anywhere. There had been interest by other federal agencies, but those requests were withdrawn, shall I say, and so the Census Bureau no longer had a reason to ask, no longer had a reason to ask about that, because every question on the form has to have a specific purpose in law or federal program, and the Bureau said it couldn't justify asking it. That said, there's some very interesting research about how you ask about gender identity and sexual orientation. There was a whole interagency task force on that, and I can send you the links to that if you like, because it's an interesting document.
You're going to hear about this because various folks in the gay community have sort of made it a sort of a point that this question was ripped off the census, that we're not going to be counted. There was really never a plan for it. And if you think about what we're going through with the whole citizenship question, was it tested? Was it tested enough? Did it follow the rules about how much testing has to be done and all that sort of thing? All this stuff would have to apply to any kind of addition of, especially a new complicated question like this, to the census. And that took years for the research on the race and ethnicity question overhaul took years. And you can imagine that this would take years too. There are federal surveys, like she mentioned, that do ask this question, so that there's sort of national level data that, depending on how you ask the question and the options you give, there's different kinds of numbers that kind of ballpark sort of where this is at. Obviously, it'd be a very complicated question to bring into the census. And think about this too. Every question you add to the census, every question that makes it longer reduces response rate, right? And it might be that this question would cause people not to answer. It would increase non-response, just like citizenship, different kinds of people. All that would obviously have to go into any kind of research they do before they could ever bring it onto the census. But it's definitely going to be one of those things that comes up because it's kind of here now. And the 2010 census data, as it was originally released, was sort of badly overstated the issue because of the mismarking that people did on the form. The people who mismarked an opposite sex couple, they mismarked their spouse, and so they became accidentally a same-sex couple. The Census Bureau ended up releasing sort of revised data on that once they went back, did the research, found where the problem was, and then revised it.
So I want to be mindful of time and just go back, and these were the issues that we were going to talk about. I feel like we've talked a lot about citizenship. Does anyone want to say anything more about it, or have we all run through? I guess I did have one thing that I wanted to say from some reading I've been doing. KPCC, which is the Southern California Public Radio, did a very interesting report in the last week or so about their thinking about how to cover the 2020 census. And one of the things they said they found in interviewing people around the community is that, in their words, several of our interviewees mentioned that they associate the census with the citizenship question since it has been in the news so often. Instead of leading our stories with updates on the court cases regarding the citizenship question, we will start by explaining why the census is important and the role it plays in our lives so that audiences have a better understanding of the stakes before they hear about incremental developments in the court battles. I'm just throwing that out, not to tell you how to do your job, but just to say that it's certainly something that has dominated the census coverage. And it'll be interesting to see how long that issue continues to be in the public forefront.
This is related to the citizenship question, but probably best answered by the census people, which is the Supreme Court is expected to have a decision by summer, but I know that the printing has to happen around July, and I'm wondering if there's a contingency plan and what it is if that decision hasn't happened by the time the printing has to happen.
We are optimistic based on the fact that this is on the Supreme Court's argument calendar for the week of April 23rd, that it will be covered in this session of the court. They realize that we have this urgency date of the end of June to get a decision. That is when the session of the Supreme Court ends. They don't reconvene until October. I'm at Never Never Land if they don't handle it before they reconvene, and therefore I would have to operate on whatever the current decisions are at that point in time, because we'd be legally obligated to the current decisions at that point in time, which right now is the New York case, which enjoins us from putting the citizenship question on. So the court knows that's the case, and so they are very actively looking at it.
I would just add one point on the citizenship decision. As he mentioned, the current legal obligation, which comes out of the New York court case ruling, that they're enjoined. They're not allowed to put it on, but they're not prevented from doing work that would put it on. So they can keep going along with bringing along all the possibilities of whatever's going to go along, so that they can then just shift once the court decides to what they need to actually do, right?
Comment on that. Yes, the answer to that is yes, and the answer to that is we are prepared at the time the court makes a decision to pass the artwork on to our printer to print whichever decision is made. That is the long pole in the tent. That's our challenge area, is the paper printing. The electronic part, we can make that switch very easily. But the printing deals with not so much what it costs, but the lead time that the printer has and the capacity that the printer has to get all the questionnaires printed. We actually have been working very hard with our print contractor over the last month to nail down their production schedule so we can be as refined as possible. I mean, I spent several hours last week with the president of our contractor working through their production capability, so we know exactly what we can do. But we are prepared at the moment that decision comes down with artwork in either direction.
So, privacy. I think we've covered this a lot, but if anyone wants to add something or ask something on this issue, one thing I might note is that the Bureau has been going through the American Community Survey, proposing questions to be dropped. In some cases, got pushed back and kept them on. But they have actually dropped a few questions in the interest of lightening what they call respondent burden. And they've talked about possibly having questions asked only every couple of years, not annually, and we'll see where that goes. It's a response to the concerns that they're hearing about how long it takes to answer and the intrusiveness question that they get sometimes.
You remember hearing earlier about how the administrative records are going to be brought in as a sort of a key to help out with the 2020 census. One of the things that they're researching is, can we use administrative records to answer some of the ACS questions or at least backstop so that we don't have to ask people about their property taxes or their mortgage payments or all that kind of detail.
On the flip side of privacy, obviously confidentiality. People have always been concerned that their answers won't be confidential. There's, with the internet-connected devices and the hacking issue, of course, that's come out again. I think the Census Bureau is trying these new techniques to preserve privacy. I guess I'd like to see them make them more explainable, because it's hard to translate some of that into language that even those of us who follow the census can understand, but I'm eager to hear what more they might have to say as this process goes on. If anyone wants to raise any ideas about that. No. Hispanic origin and race, we talked about. SOGI, the abbreviation. Prisons, the issue of prisons came up. Again, we've talked a little bit about how the Census Bureau will be helping states that would like some additional data so that they can do work within their borders about redrawing boundaries or allocating funds based on where prisoners live, what they judge as their home addresses, rather than where those prisons are. This actually raises the larger issue about other residents' rules of interest. Some of these topics have come up in the past in the census. There's a rumor that even one Commerce Secretary had to call over to the folks at the Census Bureau and ask, do I count my college kid at home or in his or her dorm? The question is, of course, you should be counted in your dorm because that's your usual residence. In the past, troops that were deployed were counted overseas. This time they'll be counted at their home bases, which some states are happy about. I think we mentioned in the past the issue resolved by the Supreme Court involving church missionaries. Anybody who's an American working abroad who's not part of the federal civilian or military workforce will not be counted. And there are lots of reasons for that. There's been lobbying for it, but the Bureau has done some work on it and found that they feel that it's impractical to do for many reasons. How would you find everybody? How would you decide where their home address is for apportionment purposes? Lots of other things. Yes.
Here. Sorry. Deborah Berry again from yesterday. You said that the military personnel will be counted at their home base now and no longer overseas. Why is that different than prisoners who are not at their home base, but why is that different? And why did they make that change and not the other change? And were prisoners always counted where they're housed? I don't know if she's not here anymore, but.
Yeah, I'm going to let the Census Bureau answer that one. I think one of the answers is that they have very good information about the home bases of deployed military people, whereas questions have been raised about whether a prisoner would return to his or her home address, that the linkage between home address and a prisoner is not always as tight, but I'm going to throw that to John.
So, a couple things. The way the Census Bureau looks at their residence rules, and they've counted prisoners, not prisoners, they've counted the American overseas military in the United States going back to the Vietnam War, when there was a lot, at least that far, when there was a lot of deployed people. So there's two classes of military. There's one class that are deployed, like for a short action. Those are counted at the base they're deployed from, because there's clear evidence that they're going to go back to that base, or they're going to go back to the off-base housing, and the military has records to do that. The other are military that are assigned overseas on a tour of duty. It's not clear where they will go on their next tour, so they're assigned to their state of record, and that's also by administrative records. That's the way the Bureau does it. It's new for this census, assigning the deployed to the base they're deployed from, but it's the concept of, where you're going to return to and be counted. And the prisoner thing, it's just a really, really rich discussion, which has been debated back and forth. That question you raised has been asked by advocates of counting the prison. What's the difference between them and the deployed military? And I don't think that there's a real good answer for that.
There is one practical distinction between those two. The Census Bureau can go to the Defense Department and say, we need the counts for all these people on the federal payroll, and they can get it. But to try to get the home addresses of all the prisoners who are in Maryland state prisons, that's a complicated process that would have to be done with each state government, and then each under some kind of set of uniform rules. Maybe that'll happen someday.
Jumping back to story ideas for a moment, will the census be releasing data about its enumerator workforce and potentially how it's changed? I mean, I think that would be interesting in this Uber economy, and also to see how well they reflect the communities they're covering.
Again, I'll let the census answer that, but you can watch for work out of GAO in the Office of Inspector General of Commerce, because I'm sure that they'll be tracking how well the census is meeting its goals for hiring.
Or will you be reporting on it to compare with 2010?
Right. So in terms of the workforce, I think we'll be very transparent in terms of the numbers that we hire and things like that, and that we're hiring from the community. I'm not aware of a single instance where we've actually done some kind of match of who the people we hired actually were relative to that population. So.
I'm just wondering, do you release average age or percentage of ages or race or things like that? I'd be curious to see whether you have
Right.
More younger people doing this work compared to 20 years ago.
Okay. That's a great question. Let us look into it. Maybe there's an assessment report I'm not aware of. I can't remember, but Field would know that for sure. So how about I'll work with Al and try to see if we can get an answer to that. It'd be a very interesting look. My assumption is that it probably has changed quite a bit, but.
The question was whether the Census Bureau has records to compare the demographics, say age and race, of current enumerators versus those from the past.
Hi, going back to the confidentiality slide, you'd mentioned automation, and should I understand that as being artificial intelligence, machine learning kinds of things, or just the fact that the technology has made the workforce, better at doing their jobs, like the Barca tool that Deidre had mentioned, things taking minutes that used to take hours, or is it more of an AI, machine learning kind of emerging technology kind of thing?
Yeah, when I put that slide together, I was really thinking of the fact that the devices would upload quickly to the server. Not anything more than that, but yes, you're absolutely correct that there are a lot more new automation operations this time, which are worth writing about and are interesting. And if Margot were still in the room, which I'd like to thank her for participating, she talks a lot about how the Census Bureau has been a technology innovator, and I think we're going to see some interesting innovations this time.
Is this working? How much instruction is there for people to know, like, oh, I don't put my college son on my household thing, or I can put more than one category of ethnic background, or like how, and can we see, like, is there some wording that we can actually see in terms of what people are going to be told?
Well, it does say under the race box, mark one or more boxes, so that.
I know, but it doesn't say you can write in a bunch of them. And I mean, just kind of, is there like a front page that says, like, you know, if your child is in prison, don't put him in the household? Like, does it spell all this out for anybody? Because we're asking you guys all these questions, but like, is the regular person going to know these things?
I know that the Bureau is going to be adding more instructions online, and there was a mention of error checks as well, and I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about that. I think the written form is sort of what it is, although you can, if you have questions, you could call in or ask them, or if an enumerator is coming to your door, they will be trained in helping you answer them.
So for the self-response forms, there are instructions on the questionnaire that outline the residence criteria as far as who to include and not to include in the form. And then there's also coverage questions that we ask about, is there any of these people in this situation, as well as both on over and under coverage. And for those cases where they do mark positively, we try to call them back to resolve the coverage issue that there might be with the form. You should, yes.
You know, we're also doing a lot of work in our communications work and our partnership support work in many of the areas we've talked about to help people get more clarity on who they should include. This is critical for the undercount of young children. We're doing some work to bring the residence criteria into more plain language, and to put that together to make it easier for people to understand, in the case of a kid in college or whatever, who it is they should include where. I think that a lot of our communications and partnership work is about education, and it's about educating people to answer the questions the best way they can. And a lot of our community representatives who work in our partnership program are doing the same thing. That helps too.
When it comes to ethnicity, are there specific guidelines as to, you know, how to choose the right ethnicity? Because, for example, a Filipino American whose father is white, they tend to write white. Or if their father is black, then they tend to write black. But Filipinos also tend to write Asians or Pacific Islander because they consider themselves Asians or Pacific Islander, although there's a specific box for Filipino.
Well, first, let me make a distinction between race and ethnicity according to the Office of Management and Budget, which determines how race and ethnicity are asked about in any federal statistical survey. There's only one ethnic origin that's on forms, and that's Hispanic or Latino. So when you're speaking of Filipino, that's considered a race or a subgroup of Asian race. There's certainly opportunity to write in a lot more information than just checking off the box. And the Bureau has specific rules to dictate how that ends up you'll be counted. Does that help? How do they know that? Well, it's self-identification. In fact, there was a very good example of that when Barack Obama was president. His mother was white, his father was black. He said that on his census form he checked the black box. Some people might have thought he was both black and white. In fact, in surveys we've done at Pew Research, that's what most white people said. He considered himself black, and that is the self-identification that the Census Bureau accepted on his behalf.
It's Christy again. I didn't think about this till Margot mentioned about the overcount issue, mainly because I have so many grandchildren. I mean, it's true, like four officially, one sort of, but this complex family relationship issue, because you said, so I'm reading all the census forms are online, every single questionnaire, right? Every decade, just Google it, right? They're all there. I'm reading the language because I was thinking, how is my daughter going to fill this out? With some of these kids are split custody, some aren't. You said, where are they April 1st? But I'm not trying to misquote you or anything. Don't worry, I'm a data reporter, not a. And on the top it says, count all people, including babies who live and sleep here most of the time. So, I mean, it's, I overthink everything all the time, but is it April? So I can see where the confusion comes in for people. It's like, okay, this kid is usually with me 60% of the time, but on April 1st, they're with this person. So, I mean, I got to be honest, I never thought about families and this because I was out of that age group, and now I'm re-entering the age group where we've got that going on. But I don't know, just story idea. It's still not clear to me, crystal clear, unlike where it says clearly do not count anyone live at college or in the army. It clearly states don't count your college kids on the form, but that one's still a little fuzzy to me.
Well, that's, as you said, a good story. Let's just take a couple more of these questions because there's a little bit of territory we want to cover at the end about census data and how to find it, and we've only got about 15 minutes left, and we haven't taken a break.
What happens to people in immigration detention centers?
Oh, that's a good question. I asked that of census officials. So if someone is in an immigration detention center, they're considered to be living in the United States, and they're counted as part of the group quarters operation, where the Bureau goes to the facility and has the manager, I believe, fill out the roster of people and their basic characteristics. And I see Al Fontenot nodding at the back of the room, so I repeated very well what he told me last night at the reception. So let's move ahead just quickly because we are running out of time. Paul and I wanted to talk briefly about the census website and also where to find census data now to help you illustrate what's going on in your communities or some of the issues that your communities might face in the 2020 census. Because there's a lot of good data out there already from past censuses, from the American Community Survey, which has yearly reports on characteristics from everything from immigration status to income, to occupation and so forth. So here's a little picture of the Census Bureau, part of the Census Bureau website. If you go there, you'll see a tab at the top that says Surveys and Programs. And if you click where that arrow shows next to 2020 Census, as currently designed, I'm sure they're going to redesign it by the time of the 2020 Census, but as currently designed, that's the go-to spot for coming up with all the information about what they're doing for the 2020 census. So on the left rail, you'll see something that says About, with basic information, Resources with more details, Research and Testing, Library has photos, videos, background documents, and then News, which are news releases. On this, you can link to the 2020 Census Operations Plan, which is very, very long, but has every detail you could want. There's also a link to a census map of different types of enumeration districts. That is, what kind of questionnaire will they get in the mail or update, leave, update, enumerate. And there's also a link to something called the Census PMR, which were quarterly briefings, updates of census operations. I think the new director of the Census Bureau, Dr. Dillingham, will be taking over those briefings April 1. But this is the spot to go to for your 2020 census news and information.
Before you move forward, is there an RSS feed or something that we can access, for stories to come in automatically to our portals?
Yes. You can sign up for census news and updates, yes, if that's what you're talking about. What I do is I've got a Google search going on for anything in the news that mentions census, and I have a separate one for anything that mentions American Community Survey. Right. And because I also write about immigration, I've got a third one for immigration. And that actually, the one with census gives you a lot. I also, on my Twitter feed, have on my TweetDeck, a column for anybody who puts 2020 census in a tweet, or anybody who puts census in a tweet. That gets a lot of very unusual ones, but 2020 census is a little bit more targeted. So there are those, and I know Stephen Buckner's going to say something else.
Yeah, I think those are perfect suggestions in terms of how to just get information that we're releasing on a routine basis, because we have over 120 annual surveys. We're putting data stories out all the time, and there's a couple other ways that we're communicating. But signing up for our every other week tip sheet, which lays out a 4 to 6 week look ahead in terms of what we're going to be releasing from a media product standpoint, is very, very useful. We have several blogs that you should be following. So one is the director's blog, which is the voice of Dr. Dillingham in terms of what he's talking about. We have something called Random Samplings, which is more of a blog for other things going on around the Census Bureau. And we have one that's focused entirely on research, called Research Matters. Those are all three very, very good to do. Sign up for our emails through on our website. You'll get a prompt as soon as you go there, and basically you can say what type of things you want to get emailed about, right? And 2020 Census is one of them. The social media properties are also very good, and you probably have noticed, I hope you have at least, we are also digging into stories, into the data a little bit deeper than we have in the past. So outside of a traditional news release or a tip sheet or a blog, we actually have somebody that used to work with Paul Hayel Nasser at USA Today, who's our editor-in-chief of something called America Counts. And this is where we actually dive into the data and tell real stories that may not have gotten told through the press release or something else. And that's a great place that's under the library section in our thing that you can sign up for stories and get sort of take that national trend that we're seeing and maybe take a look at how to highlight that locally. And then lastly, Dee, you did mention April 1st, we will be having a news conference at the National Press Club, and that will be a regular occurring type of event where the director talks to the media about where we stand with 2020 Census operations, working with Al and his team.
And in the past, those have been broadcast, and in some cases, they've let media ask questions from over the phone. So that's something to watch for.
I think he's specifically asked about RSS feeds.
I'm pretty sure that we still have the capability. We did. We just did an upgrade to the system, so I'll double check, but I'm pretty sure that you could still do that off of our news feeds.
Okay, so 10 minutes left. Where can you get census data now? This is going to be really fast, and there are other sources that I can recommend. Sometimes the folks at IRE and NICAR have tip sheets for reporters. That might be one place to look. So if you want to look for easily available census data now, the website has options via Explore Data tab on the homepage of census.gov. More in a minute. There's a state data center in every state, many of them with state demographers. The quality varies, but their responsibility is to be the liaison with the Bureau to produce information about that state based on census data. There's a link on that slide to how to find the one in your state. If I could go off message a bit, because there's a site that was funded by journalists that's not part of the Census Bureau. It's called censusreporter.org. It's very intuitive and easy to use. I've got a screenshot of it later on in my slides. And they can help you find data for your area as well as the nation on a lot of popular tables, and they also do a lot of explanation of what the data mean. And then, of course, there are research and advocacy groups, often with spin, but they often will take census data and publish it for their own purposes. So this is a screenshot of Quick Facts, which you can get for locales down to at least 5,000 people. It has every variable from total population to race to household makeup to housing stock. A lot of good information. A lot of your simple queries can be answered quite easily from Quick Facts. You can do more. American Fact Finder, which is the portal to data access more deeply. And the next iteration will be data.census.gov, which is still evolving. Stay tuned. Yes, it will replace American Fact Finder ultimately. I believe by the 2020 census. I'm not sure of the exact schedule. Do you have a release date for when it'll go fully operational?
We don't have a formal release date yet. We're still doing a lot of beta work on it, and it's still got a lot of work to be done. But our hope is to have everything go through there for the 2020 census. So one way or another, we'll have the data through an API and any other service that we build.
This is the data.census.gov. Here's what censusreporter.org looks like. If I were to scroll down the page, there would be a lot more options. It really is a handy resource for journalists. Census news and sources, and I mentioned some advocacy. We at Pew Research are, straight down the line, no spin, et cetera, et cetera. That's our intent. And yet, I rely on some groups that have an advocacy agenda because they do such a good job at collecting information. For example, in the immigration sphere, there's a group that's very conservative, but that publishes a very solid list of recent immigration publications and doesn't just include the ones that further its agenda. Similarly, the Brennan Center for Justice has a very good listing of all the documents related to census litigation, even lawsuits that it doesn't agree with. And the Brennan Center is, shall we say, to the left. I can also recommend looking at the Census Project, which is a broad-based coalition including advocacy groups, public officials, business groups, academic sectors, and so forth, that does a lot in terms of basic fact sheets and updates. The GAO you've heard about, the Office of Inspector General. I'd be interested in hearing any other sources that people here find useful.
You left off a key one from this list, and that's Pew Research, obviously. And obviously, a couple of the Twitter feeds that she generates. Why don't you talk about that?
Well, I started an All Things Census Twitter feed right around the time of the 2010 census, when we began doing a lot of writing and research around the census, and posted a lot of blog articles about explaining the operations of the 2010 census. We're planning to do the same thing around the 2020 census, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you for participating. Any other questions or things to
Maybe
add?
just one other ad. So in addition to the state data centers, they have a great website for each state. They are a tremendous resource to help you mine down into any data product, and they have access to a lot of state data in addition to understanding census data. We also have census information centers, which are geared towards serving traditionally underserved populations. They're housed usually in a minority academic institution, but they deal really with a lot of the racial and ethnic minority population groups, and they're scattered across the country. We also have a relationship with them. We have a website dedicated to both the state data centers and the census information centers on our website. Those are both great resources, and then a lot of people don't realize that we have data training people out in the field in your areas that if you request a presentation for any size group or just to walk you through basic Census 101 or a particular data set, they're happy to get on the phone or come in person and do a presentation. It's a data dissemination specialist program. So you can get those through Census, through my contact information if you have any more questions about that.
Thank you, and I think we'll wrap up.